Well, hello, everybody. Couple things up front before I take your questions. So the very big picture first. I met this morning with Speaker Hastie and then later on with Leader Stuart Cousins. And I, in many, many years of doing this work, have never had the experience I had today of two strong, coherent Democratic leaders in these two chambers. And I felt like, history had fundamentally changed. I really did. It was extraordinary. A lot of us have spent decades literally waiting for this day. And I cannot describe to you how hopeful I am for the whole state and certainly for the people in New York City. It feels like things are going to be very different in terms of the possibilities for real change and rapid change. It feels like the dynamics here are going to be fundamentally different. And it was very hopeful to me. So that's sort of a big picture reflection I wanted to offer. Obviously, I went to the governor's speech and I met with the governor afterwards. I would say, big picture, the speech reflected the changes. And that is a credit, first of all, to everyone who worked for all those years for change, but also I want to give due credit to the governor. They put into the speech a whole series of reforms that I think are very positive, obviously. Election reforms and reforms to protect the rights of women and of immigrants and a host of ideas that show that there's been a fundamental change in this state. So there's a lot to like in the speech. And certainly, that wasn't in the speech, but that he put out separately today, the support for a 3-year extension of mayoral control of education is a very positive sign for the city. A couple of things I would take issue with, and I'll say up front that I have not seen, nor has anyone on my team, the details of his budget. We're responding to top lines here, so I just want to affirm to everyone this is a very preliminary assessment based on what we've seen put out today, a lot more to go through. But look, everyone knows on the MTA that I think we need a long-term funding solution. It's not something that can be paid for out of the city budget. Also, the representation of the funding history simply wasn't accurate. It was one version of that history, but does not reflect the reality as we know it. And our team will give you the details on that and show you why we think the chart that was put up there was not accurate. On the question of schools, I would say that the notion that we need to constantly focus on underprivileged schools is 100% correct. I cannot speak for any other part of the state. I don't know the details of the other jurisdictions. Obviously, I do know they have school board structures, not mayoral control education. I can say under a mayoral control model that we have in New York City for the last 5 years, we have consistently moved resources to schools in greater need. Not only through the Fair Student Funding formula changes, but also through the huge programmatic initiatives, pre-K, 3K, computer science for all, advanced placement for all, college access for all, community schools, many, many initiatives that disproportionately help schools in need. So the chart that was put up showing the per pupil costs in the so-called richer schools and poorer schools, again, did not reflect the reality we know in New York City, and we'll put out information today to correct that. The impulse, healthy for sure, the facts not accurate in the case of New York City. What we do need to address the whole statewide issue on education is to get back to the principles of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity and fully fund the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. That's been true for a decade now, and that is really the best way to get to a focus on fairness and equity and bringing up schools that have not gotten what they deserve. So those are some big picture reflections. Again, I don't have the benefit of a detailed analysis because we haven't seen all the details, but I'm happy to take questions based on what I do know.
Mayor, we noticed when he was proposing the 50-50 split on the MTA costs in the future, you sat there pretty, I assume, stone-faced. We could tell you weren't applauding from behind.
I was not applauding.
What was that about?
I just disagree with the concept. I've made it clear before that we need a long-term funding solution. And I remind people there was a point when the MTA was in crisis some years ago, and the legislature and the governor at the time made the decision that the payroll tax was the way to save the MTA and keep it solvent, keep it going. That was a recognition that we simply can't afford to pay for the MTA out of the city budget or even the state budget. We need an independent revenue source. I always invoke Dick Ravitch on this because I think he's one of the great experts in the recent history of the city. One of the people who helped us out of the fiscal crisis, helped turn around the MTA. He's one of the most powerful voices in saying, if we're not serious about a major long-term funding source, we're not going to solve the problem. Now, there's a lot of good ideas on the table, and here's a chance to decide which combination of those ideas will actually solve the problem. But you can't take it out of the city budget. It's not going to work.
It's basically the same thing that was giving a speech today at the MTA board. The governor's own engineering consultants admitted that rebuilding the tunnel instead of this patch and Band-Aid plan would be preferable. What do you make of that, and can the city kill the governor's redone L-train plan?
It's too early to tell. Look, I think the governor's first instinct here that there should be a real effort to find a better plan. That was a fair view. What I said at the time when I first heard it was we need to see all the details, which is why we've kept all of the measures in place and ready for whatever might happen with the L train. We still have not done a full analysis of the proposal that came over from the MTA for this new approach. So, this is additional information we're going to have to look at. But the bottom line from the city perspective is we're going to be ready for either eventuality. We have the measures that we were ready to do, waiting to see what pans out here. We have to protect the safety of all New Yorkers. That's the #1 concern. But it's just too early to tell. There's a lot more analysis needed.
When the governor first announced that he was overhauling the MTA's L-train shutdown plan, your office put out a statement saying this is a heck of a way to run a railroad. Is that still the case when you have the governor's own plan now coming under?
That was a comment, let's be clear, that was a comment on the MTA. I want to be very clear. The governor's impulse to say, is there a way to do this faster, is there a way to do this better, I think was a good impulse. Obviously, the devil's always in the details. The question that we raised at the time was, how did the MTA not evaluate this alternative, which looked promising and helpful? We now need a fuller analysis to understand what this is and what this isn't. So that's what we were referring to at the time. What I want to know, and I want our experts to look at this from scratch, is what's going to be the safest approach, obviously, and the approach that causes the least disruption for New Yorkers. I'm not going to prejudge which it is.
Should the City Department of Transportation do its own analysis of whatever the MTA comes up with, considering all the issues that have been brought to light?
Look, we are going to work with the MTA. We're going to review what they've done. We're certainly going to use our own experts to look at the situation. It's very consistent with the point I made about not taking down the plan to be ready to address the L-train shutdown the way it was originally configured. Until we're satisfied that we have a non-moving target here and we know what's going to happen, we're going to keep all those measures ready to go. But we're going to look at it with our own experts, but we'll do it collegially with the MTA. Yes?
So you said rent reforms are one of your biggest priorities in this year's legislative session. The governor mentioned certain reforms in his speech today, but was fairly brief. Do you think he devoted enough time to the issue, and do you think he's committed to those reforms?
Look, I think it was very important that he laid it out so clearly, meaning it may have been brief, but it was uncompromising, and I was happy to see that. Again, I'll say on everything, until we see the final language in his budget, we'll reserve judgment. But the basic notion of coming out and saying we need MCI reform, we need to end vacancy decontrol, we need to end the abuse of preferential rent, those are foundational elements to strengthening rent regulation. Now, I think it is a statement on all the changes that have happened in the last 2 years that this package of fundamental reforms has such an extraordinary head of steam at this point, that you have the leaders of both bodies in the legislature focusing on this as among their top priorities. You saw there was a standing ovation for the idea, which represented a lot of the energy around it. That was inconceivable before the November election. So I think that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to have much stronger rent regulation. It's going to help us preserve affordable housing in New York City. And certainly from what the governor said in the speech, I'm encouraged. Yeah.
It appears as though they're going to move forward on some form of congestion pricing. I know you've had some concerns
Yes.
about that. And do you feel as though it's taken off the table some kind of increase in taxes on the wealthiest people?
I don't think anything's off the table yet. I think this is really the beginning of the serious process. I still believe the millionaire's tax is the single fairest, most progressive way to address the issue and the most sustainable, and it has tremendous popular support. But I said in my State of the City that, I want to see any and all proposals. I want to see what the legislature could be comfortable with. The most important need here is to come up with a long-term sustainable plan, and ultimately that has to be one that the legislature feels good about. But I don't think anything's off the table. In fact, I go the other way, and I think everything's on the table. I think people should be looking at a State Transportation Bond Act. I think they should be looking at the marijuana revenue, which will come from legalization. I think everything should be on the table, and then we put together a package that makes sense. But that package should not involve raiding the city budget. I don't even think it's realistic to raid the state budget. I think it needs to be a stand-alone revenue package.
Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
On marijuana, what are your initial reactions to the governor's plan? There's some details kind of floating around.
Sure. Again, not having seen the larger analysis, but from what he put in the speech, I was very encouraged. I put out a report last month about the right way to legalize marijuana. One of the most central concerns that I have is making sure we don't have another industry run wild, like happened with the tobacco industry for decades, where they were purposely denying the health impacts and very effectively hooking generation after generation on cigarettes. And the other example, of course, is the pharmaceutical industry with the creation and promotion of OxyContin and similar drugs while suggesting they were not addictive, hooking a generation of Americans on them, and fostering the opioid crisis. Those were preventable tragedies. We are present at the creation here in New York State. We have a chance in a progressive state to come up with ground rules that will not allow for a corporate takeover of the marijuana industry. I was encouraged to see the governor explicitly single out the problems of the corporate sector and suggest, as I believe fundamentally, as my report makes clear, that this should be a community-based form of business, a small business focus, and a focus on those who were economically harmed by the previous policies. So that's an important step. And again, I give the governor credit, but I also want to give credit to this movement in the last couple of years in New York State for progressive change that I think is informing this whole discussion.
The governor's office suggests that 60% of sales would come from New York City. Do you think that's a high estimate, a low estimate?
Look, we're 43% of the state's population. On the other hand, we have a huge number of people come in, each day to work. We have 4.5 million jobs, and we have 62 million tourists every year. It would be fair to suggest that the numbers might be larger proportionally in New York City because all those people are in New York City, even though they're not our residents. But I don't think we have a specific breakout at this point. I think the idea is to legalize this the right way. There's going to be a lot of energy around getting the legalization done, and that's perfectly fair. But the report we put out literally went item by item: safety, health, how to make sure it's economically fair, how not to repeat the mistakes of previous industries. I really hope everyone up here makes sure they do this the smart way, not just the fast way. Let me see if there's anything else.
Yeah. So they legalized sports betting, but apparently they're going to push for it only for the upstate casinos. It's a long trip from the city to any casino upstate. It's a lot easier to hop across the river and go to Jersey. Are you worried about the amount of money the city's going to lose from that?
I've always felt really profoundly mixed feelings about casino gambling. I do recognize the economic realities, and certainly we all have to be concerned about not letting revenue leave our state that could be used for important things like education or affordable housing. But on the other hand, gambling obviously for a lot of people is an addiction, and it often undermines the lives of folks who are already struggling to make ends meet. So I have mixed feelings. I don't have a really sharp, clear answer for you because I have personally very mixed feelings.
If I could circle back just to the MTA for a second. Everyone's talking about, the MTA needs more money, the MTA needs more money, the MTA needs more money. There are huge, well-known cost inefficiencies at the MTA.
Yes.
Whether it's two operators on every subway train, whether it's the building trades having contracts that mean we spend 5 times as much to build a mile of subway as Paris or London do. Is there anything the city can do to force that into the discussion as well? Because if congestion pricing throws off $1 billion a year and the MTA is running $1 billion budget deficit every year, all the money's gone.
Well, first of all, congestion pricing would obviously bring in a certain amount of revenue, or any of these other models. Millionaire's tax would bring a certain amount of revenue, and then you can bond off of that revenue. So the amplified effect is much greater. I think the governor pointed out a potential $15 billion impact just from his iteration of congestion pricing. So I just want to be clear. I think there's a lot of revenue potential. But to your question.
You can't bond against revenue that you've already obligated towards operating expenses.
My point to you only is if we are smart about what we do with the revenue we bring in, we're going to stretch the impact of it. And it's not simply, it should not just be seen as a dollar comes in and that's the end of the discussion when you have bonding capacity off of it. Right. But to your underlying point, it is not enough to simply come up with a revenue package and then repeat the same mistakes of the past in terms of how money is spent. I think we need to figure out what the MTA's real needs are, which I still don't think we have a clear enough picture of. We need to figure out how to make the MTA much more efficient. The city stands ready to work with the state on that and find ways to improve the operations of the MTA. I mean, look, the East Side Access, I'd be thrilled if it gets done one day, but it's kind of the poster child for inefficiency. We need to get to a different kind of approach in the MTA. Now, while we're having the governance discussion and while we're having the budget discussion, that's a good time to figure out the efficiency question too. And we're ready to work with the state to resolve those issues.
The governor's speech today didn't mention charters at all. The city's at its cap. Have you had discussions with the governor's office about charters and the cap or any?
I'm very clear that I think there's no need for any additional cap space. I have not talked to the governor about it myself, and I don't know if my team has. Let me see if there's anything else. Go on once, twice. Enjoy Albany, everybody. Thank you.